So let's tackle that first one, shall we? That first argument against the historical reliability of the New Testament. That we have a 2,000-year-old document with 1,600 years of transmission. You know, copying copy after copy after copy after copy until we get what we have today. How can we trust that? That's the first kind of thing that Dr. Ehrman brings up, by the way. So obviously that seems like significant data to him. But again, just like in our last argument, those numbers are only really imposing and intimidating when you don't understand them. What we have up here on the board are 5 histories written by 5 ancient historians who record in their own time period that are considered to be among most college professors and most historians today to be considered historically relevant and accurate. These guys are trusted. If you go to take a college course in their particular era of human history, these guys will get quoted and will say that this guy knew what was going on. Now I want to show you when they supposedly wrote their originals, because just like the New Testament, we don't have any of their originals left. All we have are copies. Then we're going to talk about how old those copies are. How much of a gap between our oldest copies and the supposed original writings. Then we're going to talk about the numbers, but hang on to that for just a second. I think when we compare the New Testament to these, you'll see something pretty interesting. Let's start out with Livy, shall we? We have Livy apparently writing sometime in between 59 BC to AD 17. Now, that's when he's supposed to have written originally. And remember, we don't have the original. We only have copies. What's the oldest copy we have? How close can we get to that date? 4th century. That means that there is roughly a 400-year gap between the original and the oldest copy we have. Let's go to Tacitus for a second. Tacitus is supposed to have written somewhere between AD 56 and AD 120. What's the oldest copy we have? 9th century. Now we're going to be a little generous. We could say that's 800 years, but let's be a little generous and say, round down to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that that's still a 700-year gap. Same thing with Suetonius, AD 79 to 140. Oldest copy we have, 9th century. So again, being generous, we have to say that that is a 700-year gap. Then Thucydides, we have a 460 to 400 BC, hear me on that, BC, original authorship. What's the oldest manuscript we have? 1st century. Again, let's be generous and say 400. 400 years. Herodotus, same thing, 484 to 425 BC. 1st century is, again, the oldest manuscript we have, the oldest copy we have, 400-year gap. Hope you notice these gaps, 400, 700, 700, 400, 400. Now, these are just 5. We could keep going, but I want to focus on these because, again, they're all considered to be historically relevant and accurate. These are trusted historians. Okay, so how many surviving copies? Here we have the oldest manuscripts, but how many manuscripts do we have surviving between those periods? Surviving to now, today. How many do we have for Livy? We have 27 for Livy. Okay? What about Tacitus? We have a whopping 3. Just 3. Now Suetonius, we actually kind of lucked out. We have a whole lot for him. 200 plus. Wow, he was a pretty popular author, right? We have a lot of surviving documents. Thucydides, writing in the BC, remember, how many do we have? We have 20. What about Herodotus? He was even more popular. 75. Now, I hope you notice this. We have 25 surviving documents, the oldest of which date from the 4th century. That is a 400-year gap for Livy. 3 for Tacitus, earliest dating from the 9th century. That's a 700-year gap from the original authorship. 200 plus for Suetonius. That's a really good number. Oldest manuscript we have of that 200 plus, 9th century, but that's a 700-year gap. 20 for Thucydides. 1st century is the oldest, 400-year gap. Same thing for Herodotus. 75, 1st century, 400-year gap. Now, again, these are people you can go to college and read about. You can reference them in papers, and your professor will take the reference. So how does the New Testament stack up to this? Check this out. Let's add the New Testament down here at the bottom. Okay? Original date. We have roughly between the 60s AD to 90s AD, roughly. Okay? So, first century authorship. 2,000 years old, right? What about the oldest manuscripts we have? The oldest one we have. Now, granted, they're partial, but the oldest one we have, we think, at latest, second century. Now, we do have a lot more from much later than that. But the oldest manuscripts we have, second century. How much of a gap is that? Now, let's round up. Let's do the opposite for the New Testament. 100 years. How many manuscripts do we have? Now, look up here. Poor Tacitus is sitting here with just 3. We have 27 and 20 for 27 and 20 for Thucydides and Livy. 75 for Herodotus. That's pretty good. A whopping 200 plus for Suetonius. Now, here's why that's important. Because the more manuscripts you have, the better, right? I mean, think about it. If you're putting together a puzzle, you have so many pieces to put that puzzle together from. Now, the more pieces, the more difficult it is. But have you ever been putting together a puzzle and you've been missing pieces? Maybe you get close to the end and you realize, oh, there's just a couple left and you can't finish. You want a certain number of pieces. Now, you only have 3 remaining pieces in the puzzle. That is Tacitus. Yet he's trusted. You have 27 in the puzzle for Livy remaining. Thucydides 20, Herodotus 75. How many do we have for the New Testament? For the Greek New Testament, just in Greek, how many do we have? We have, as we've already stated, 5,700 manuscripts. Now, that's significant for a pretty powerful reason. I don't know how many of you have heard this argument leveled against the Bible. People like to compare biblical transmission, that 1,600 years of transmission. They want us to kind of take the idea that that's like the telephone game. You ever play the telephone game? Where you have one person sit at the beginning of a line of a bunch of people, and the teacher comes up and gives them a sentence or a phrase to pass it on. They whisper it in the next person's ear and they say such and such and such, such, pass it on. And by the time they get to the end, it's completely garbled and it's completely missing. People say, well, the longer the line is, the more garbled it gets. Let's talk about long lines, shall we? Look how long the line is for Livy. It's 400 years long. 700 for Tacitus, 700 for Suetonius, Thucydides 400, Herodotus 400. How long is the line for the New Testament? It's only 100 years. But still, that's still a pretty long line. Still, it's 100 years removed. Why are we supposed to trust it? How can we trust that these copies who claim to have what the originals say actually say what the originals say when there's 100 years of copying between the two? How many copies do we have? 5,700. Now imagine you're playing telephone again, but instead of playing telephone with one line of transmission, one person, just a group of people sitting in one line, whispering back and forth, getting garbled at the end. What if you had 5,700 lines? And at the beginning of each line, all of the people are getting the same message. Now, even if you only have what the people at the end of each line have, how difficult do you think it would be to reverse engineer what the original message was? It'd be a lot easier than if you only had one line or, 3. But here's the thing. Let's really think about this now. What we're looking at here, again, using the analogy of a puzzle, here's how Dan Wallace, a believing textual critic, puts it. Think of it this way. When we're looking at the New Testament, we see a great big puzzle. Let's say we have a 9,000-piece puzzle in front of us to put together to get the original readings. 9,000 pieces. Guess how many pieces we have? We have a 9,000-piece puzzle in front of us with 10,000 pieces. That number seems imposing by itself, but when you really realize what that number means, that number is great. The bigger, the better. Look how many these guys are working with. 27, 3, 200 plus, 20, 75. How many does the New Testament have? 5,700. You know what that means? That means that not only is the New Testament historically accurate, not only can it be trusted upon reliably based upon the documentary evidence that we have, it's the most well-attested document in human history. No ancient document, forget these five, throw the New Testament up against any ancient history or document that we have that is considered credible. The New Testament beats it every single time. You see, at the beginning of this video, we showed you that clip by Dr. Ehrman. And here's what he said. He said that we don't have any of the original readings. He's right. We don't. But we do have 5,700 copies of the original, only 100 years at earliest removed from the original authorship. Granted, there are much, much later ones, but we have 5,700 of them. And we have very, very, very early ones, much earlier than any of these other guys had. I don't see how that's a problem. In fact, I think that makes the Bible the most historically reliable document in human history. But even within those 5,700 documents, we have the 138,000 words of the Greek New Testament. And we realize that there are 400,000 variants. Well, we've already shown that 99% of those variants are non-meaningful. And the 1% that are do not affect Christian doctrine. They are in passages where we can afford to agree to disagree. All the relevant doctrinal passages, well, no variance found there. This is what we call, these numbers are what we call a straw man, a red herring, something set up to be imposing, to look like a good argument, but as soon as you start poking holes in it, well, there's no argument really here at all.